Well, in today's India, where nationalism, patriotism and Hindu Rashtra are some of the terms that frequently dominate discourse, there is often a my way or the highway method in labeling citizens. If you are not nationalist, you are anti-national, and there is often no scope to debate or discuss or disagree on the notion of nationalism or patriotism. Certainly not on Twitter if you know what's good for you. But that's exactly what Shashi Tharoor has done in this fabulous book, The Battle of Belonging on Nationalism, Patriotism and What It Means to be Indian. Now, it's not just a look back at how nationalism and patriotism were defined in the past and how that's changed. It is equally a scathing attack on this government, with perhaps the larger goal of trying to understand where we as Indians are going in defining our sense of belonging in the future. Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much for being with us. I've had the opportunity of going through the book, reading it quite carefully. It's very interesting. Now, as we go through several of the points that you've actually focused on, I think it's important right up off the top in defining patriotism and nationalism. How do you define this as you went through several themes?
Right. Well, I mean, the fact is that patriotism is essentially the love of your country. It's akin in many ways to the love of your mother. It's where you were born or to which place you associate yourself. And it's yours. It's your home. You love it because it's yours. You love it despite its flaws. So patriotism is not about anything but a pure, unbridled love for that to which you belong and which you claim belongs to you. Nationalism is actually love of a more abstract idea, a state, a flag, a notion of a nation. And it's very often, unfortunately, expressed in opposition to others. It's your nationalism against others. Now, when it's a freedom movement fighting against a foreign imperialist oppressor, nationalism, as opposed to British rule in India, is morally understandable and justifiable. But when you look at nationalism in the contemporary situation, it very often becomes a totalizing sort of idea in which you are obliging people to essentially sacrifice their individuality, their critical faculties, essentially to rally behind you, the flag, the government, the state, in how you define the interests of the nation to be. So nationalism and patriotism are quite distinct. Now, you can have a benign nationalism,
right,
and that's what I talk about.
I talk about nationalism.
The nationalism enshrined in our constitution, which one can call civic nationalism. And the thing about civic nationalism is it's a nationalism of institutions, of principles, of values. It is not a nationalism based on immutable identity factors like your birth, your religion, your language, those things which are constitutive of ethno-religious.
It's not based on aggression either.
And it's not based on aggression, because it's all about people fulfilling themselves through these institutions and principles. Now, our constitution actually reflects that. So I'm not really talking about anything new. It may be a new term to describe something which is already embedded in our constitution.
Right.
And our constitution sets up institutions, procedures, ways of being, and establishes freedoms that apply to all citizens, irrespective of language, region, birth, religion, caste, and all of those disabilities.
So therefore, let me ask you this and quote a little bit from the book. And the issue is this: has India's nationalism been reshaped? And you argue it has. And you say national ideals have been redefined and repurposed. Unity has given way to uniformity. Patriotism has been reborn as chauvinism. Independent institutions are yielding to a dominant government. Democracy is being reshaped into one-man rule. This isn't the India that you were born in, right?
No, and in fact, as I mentioned in the book, I wasn't even born in India. I was born an Indian, of very proud Indian parents, but I happened to be born in London. And so I did have the right, in fact, theoretically, I still have the right to exercise a conscious choice as to whether I want the passport of the country I was born in. I've never exercised that choice because I've felt very fundamentally the importance of Indianness in my being, in my life, and in terms of what I believe I stand for in the world, as well as what I see when I look into a mirror. And the India in which I grew up in, because though I was born in London, we returned to India when I was 2.5. I grew up in India. I went to school in Mumbai, in Calcutta, and college in Delhi before going off again for graduate studies abroad and then joining the United Nations. And so having grown up in India from 2.5 to 19.5, I grew up developing a very strong sense of the whole of India, what India stood for, what India represented in the world, what India was trying to achieve as a country. And I wanted to be part of that adventure, which is why at the end of my UN career, I chose to come back here rather than to work anywhere else. Having said all of that, my life is just one. I mean, there are 1.32 billion lives that matter. What really, for me, is constitutive of Indianness is precisely what the nationalist movement gave us through the constitution.
So I'll come to that. I'll come to that because I'm just sort of asking question after question, and that's very much the core of what we'll get to. My next sort of theme, which I picked up over here, is multi-religious democracy being converted into a Hindu Rashtra?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact is that we have seen this is very much part of the agenda of the ruling party and the movement from which it emerges. And we've had it reaffirmed by many leaders of the ruling establishment, of the ruling BJP, and indeed of the RSS. The only thing is that what Hindu Rashtra means seems to keep changing in definition from speech to speech. And as I've discussed in a rather significant speech, Mr. Bhagwat, the head of the RSS, implied that Hindu Rashtra does not mean excluding non-Hindus. We'll have to see how this works out in practice. But I think it's very difficult to live in India today and not be aware of the increasing majoritarianism that is trying to convert the civic nationalism of the constitution into a Hindu Rashtra of today. It doesn't mean they'll tear up the constitution. Maybe that's no longer on their agenda, though it certainly was for a long time. But it's certainly clear that the idea of a state that is principally for the Hindus of this country is deeply embedded in the psyche, in the political DNA of the ruling party.
So therefore is India's notion of, and this is my next question, my next main point here, therefore is India's notion of civic nationalism dead?
Well, no. I mean, I think the book is part of an ongoing struggle, really, in some ways, to define what Indianness is all about. Is it too civil, Shashi?
Because you've said, you've asked, is civic nationalism then too civil to be nationalism at all? What did you mean by that?
So that was early on in laying out the various theories of nationalism worldwide. The criticism of civic nationalism is that it doesn't seem to require any acid test. Anybody can join. It's like almost subscribing to a club. In theory, in civic nationalism, you can tomorrow go off, Vishnu, and become a citizen of the United States. And it doesn't matter that you're not white, that you're not Christian, that you didn't go to school there, that you didn't study there. And people say, what kind of nationalism is that? You know, that's just, you're off. It's like switching from one club to another. And that, to many people, is not serious nationalism. I respectfully disagree. I asked the question in order to lay all our arguments out fairly. But I believe that the kind of love that you feel for your country, in this case, India, which comes from your own intimate associations with various aspects of it, that love is itself in many ways a combination of lots of sort of local patriotisms. The love of a Kashmiri for Kashmiriyat, the love of a Bengali for the Bengal of the Durga Puja and the Rasgulla and the Hilsa and the Mache Jhol, and the love of the Keralite for his Sadhya, or the love of a Maharashtrian. The point I'm trying to make up is that we have all of these very intimate senses of being and belonging Indian, which cumulatively add up to the Indianness protected in the Constitution. So it's not as if we don't have passion throbbing in our blood and in our veins. I quote a famous Kerala poet, Vallathol, as saying that when you hear the name of India, yes, you know, pride must swell in your heart. And when you hear the name of Kerala, the blood must throb in your veins. I mean, that's the sort of, if you like, national patriotism as a combination of little patriotisms that makes India so unusual and so special. Okay. And I cherish that. I don't want to see all this being reduced to some sort of monolith, to one religion, one language, one type of Indianness, the kind of uniformity that the present government seems to prefer to unity.
But at the same time, there are problems in where our democracy has taken us. For example, you ask or you state democracy has failed to unify us as a people or create an undivided political community. Instead, we become more conscious than ever of what divides us: religion, region, caste, language, ethnicity. So has democracy failed so many decades later in unifying us?
It hasn't failed. It's worked in a way that has perhaps not been ideal, because some of the things that I've pointed out that you just quoted are real. I mean, we do know that people are much more conscious than they were expected to be. In the 50s, people like Nehru confidently expected that caste would disappear. Instead, it became more entrenched because of the political mobilization of caste required by democracy. So democracy worked, and as a result, certain social habits got entrenched. Similarly, who would have predicted that you'd have the rise of so many regional parties? That too is a result of democracy working, not of it not working. But democracy has worked, but in ways in which some of the original concepts of our nationhood have had to be redefined. Some would argue had to be diluted. Now, the answer to that is not to try and press gang everybody into a uniformity, which is what the BJP version or the Hindutva version of nationalism seeks to do. It seems to me that one can live with these diverse expressions of subnational identities and still be a proud nationalist, in the sense of owing allegiance to a broader idea of India. Indianness permits you to have multiple identities. You can be a good Bengali, a good Muslim, and a good Indian all at once.
Right.
That ultimately is something very few countries are able to say. And I think we would really be foolish to let that go.
And that's based on managing consensus, right? Has India survived essentially by agreeing to manage how the rules of consensus, right?
Yeah. So there my argument is, look, in a democracy.
Sorry, let me repeat. Manage without consensus. And I want to quote this because I really found this important. The reason India has survived all the stresses and strains that have beset it for over 70 years and that led so many to predict its imminent disintegration is that it maintained consensus on how to manage without consensus. That's what you believe we essentially are.
That's it, because democracy lays down the rules of the road. It tells you can do all of these different things. You can disagree on fundamental principles, ideological issues, political platforms, disagree. But while there is absolutely no requirement to agree all the time, there is a requirement to agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. That's how you manage without consensus. So if you disagree with Mr. Modi, you cannot go out and try and overthrow his government. You can challenge his party, criticize his policies, and contest against him in the next election. That's what the rules of democracy are all about. And then you don't need to agree with Mr. Modi. You see, the entire point is that there is, in any democracy, there should be and has to be a multiplicity of voices, opinions, and ways of even identifying and shaping who we are and what matters to us. But we do it within rules, and those are the rules laid down by our Constitution.
You've also spoken about historical revisionism. For example, and my next question is, the Modi government retelling the story of our independence. How would you answer that?
Yeah, they are. I mean, let's face it. I mean, the Modi government is the political heir of the Hindu Mahasabha movement. I mean, essentially, Hindu Mahasabha led to the Jan Sangh, led to the BJP, and that's what we have today. And this is the tradition. Their heroes are people who are identified with a very overtly Hindu expression of thought. Now, who are these people in terms of the nationalist struggle? They were either absent altogether from the fray or they actively collaborated with the British. I mean, this is simply a matter of historical record. I'm not casting stones at anybody, but it is a fact. And in fact, the Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League of Jinnah were in many ways mirror images of each other. They were in agreement that Hindus and Muslims were two different nations. And in fact, when the British gleefully seized upon the Congress resignations of their ministries, when the British declared the Second World War and Congress resigned their ministries in protest, what the British tried to do was to give those ministries to parties that had not been elected to hold those positions in the first place, namely precisely the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha, right, who actually worked in coalition in a couple of states. They worked together with each other in collaboration with the British in order to enjoy the loaves and fishes of office that the Congress had vacated. Now, this is the history. And now for them to be celebrating the Quit India movement, which they had actually betrayed, to put it bluntly, when it happened in 1942, for them to be talking about, Saat Saal Ki Qurbani and so on, as Mr. Modi has done, for them to be trying to appropriate the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi, whom they had despised when he was alive and who some not some, but several elements of the RSS and the Mahasabha celebrated Mahatma Gandhi's assassination by distributing sweets and laddus.
We'll talk about Gandhiji in a moment.
Disapproved of. So, I mean, the history of the nationalist movement.
That was absolutely fascinating. We'll talk about Gandhiji in a moment. In one of the chapters...
My point simply is, when you say, are they rewriting the history of the movement? Yes, they are. They're also trying to appropriate people like Sardar Patel onto their side, whereas Sardar Patel was fundamentally very, very critical of the RSS.
Has the Indian soul been partitioned?
Has the Indian soul been partitioned? Not yet. I do write about my fear that it could be, in the sense that when you start sort of dividing people in the mind, you're also dividing people in the soul. We've had a division in the soil of India in 1947. What I fear is, as we keep speaking of us and them, of Hindus and non-Hindus, of Hindi speakers and non-Hindi speakers, of North versus South, we are in fact partitioning the Indian soul. I don't think it's happened yet, but there are people attempting to do it.
There's a quote which I found a bit of the book, not directly sort of linked to my question on whether India's soul has been partitioned, but I think it does in a sense allude to that. And here's what you've said. National ideals have been redefined and repurposed. Unity has given way to uniformity. Patriotism has been reborn as chauvinism. Independent institutions are yielding to a dominant government. Democracy is being reshaped into one-man rule. So in a sense, isn't this what you would consider India's soul being divided, partitioned?
Yeah, those are the elements and others that I fear have been unleashed by those who are in power for the last 6 years. And that's why I believe, we really are not questioning this enough. The book is an exercise in saying to the nation, wait a minute, what are we seeing happening here? This is not just about a few elections here or there, or a different individual as prime minister, or a political party coming to power against another political party. This is actually a very serious attempt to redefine what being Indian means. This is essentially undoing the premises of 70 years of civic nationalism enshrined in our constitution to create, even within that constitution, a totally different notion of India. It's still proceeding in fits and starts on a piecemeal basis, but the intent, I'm afraid, has become very apparent. And this is why the book wants to start off by taking the battle to the territory that they have tried to arrogate for themselves, the territory of nationalism. So I ask, what is nationalism? How is it understood around the world? How is it practiced? How was it practiced by our founding fathers and mothers? What is the nationalism of our constitution? And at the end of the day, what is the present government trying to do to that nationalism to shape it in a different way for themselves? And of course, since my colors are nailed to the mast, it's very clear what I'm arguing is to fight for an India that enshrines this principle of civic nationalism rather than, and anchored in patriotism, rather than the kind of Hindutva nationalism that the ruling party is pushing.
Is the slogan Bharat Mata Ki Jai a challenge to the notion of a motherland?
It need not have been, but it has become so. Again, I go through the history of this and I explain how it's evolved. I explain why many people didn't object to it. And I explain why some people do object to it. And then thrusting it on the unwilling is the problem. We do need to proceed in mutual agreement amongst all Indians as to what we're all about. And that includes things like what slogans we want to consensually express. If, for example, a Muslim Indian says, I'm perfectly happy to say Jai Hind or Jai Bharat, but I won't say Bharat Mata Ki Jai because my religion or my understanding of my religion forbids me from maternalizing and deifying my nation. And not all Muslims will say that, but some do.
Yes.
I think my constitution grants that gentleman or lady the right to dissent from that. Whereas what's happened in the present government's approach is that there is no room for dissent. This is being thrust on the unwilling. It's being made a sort of litmus test for your nationalism. Are you willing to say Bharat Mata Ki Jai? I've actually been sitting in an audience in which the then president of the BJP addressed the audience and challenged everyone to raise their hands and say Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And I had actually no problem saying it myself, but I didn't want to go along with saying it because a political party president was trying to choose that slogan to make a political point with, and I refused. And then he asked us to ask those who refused to raise their hands. I didn't raise my hand either because I don't mind saying the slogan. I just don't want it to be done in this context and in this way. These are some of the challenges that the government is needlessly thrusting upon Indians. There are very good Indian citizens loyal to the country who don't necessarily believe that mouthing that particular slogan is the only way they can prove their patriotism or their loyalty to India.
Shashi, has the Hindutva movement redefined nationalism in its own terms? Before you answer that, this is what you've said. Liberalism, diversity, pacifism and pluralism are portrayed as flabby weaknesses, preventing the full development of the nation and undermining India's ability to develop a strong and modern society. Would you like to add to that?
So that's certainly the perspective of people around the ruling party, and it's implicit in a lot of their political sloganeering and their conscious articulation. I have a lot of respect for the Prime Minister's ability to articulate what he believes in and stands for. And this emerges very much from any careful reading or listening to his speeches. There are not too many heavyweight intellectuals in the Hindutva project, but those there are, I think, will not disagree with that characterization that you've just read out. I think that's the way they see Indian nationalism, and they do feel it necessary to remake it in a certain way that some of us feel is actually a betrayal of what we've understood Indianness to be all about.
Has nationalism been militarized?
To some degree. What they've tried to do is they've exalted the army. If you're a recipient of BJP and right-wing WhatsApp messages, as I am, I think you can see the way in which the army is exalted. I exalt the army, but I exalt different things about the army. Of course, I exalt their bravery, their self-sacrifice, and their courage. But I don't fetishize the army. I don't believe my army right or wrong. And what is more, I celebrate things like the diversity within the army. I celebrate the fact that we have every religion represented in the army. I celebrate the fact that we have religious preachers or chaplains from every faith attached to our military forces. There's lots and lots of wonderful stories about the army that affirm my idea of Indian nationalism. I don't want to see this totally secular institution being tarnished with this kind of Hindutva brush of the army becoming an instrument of a warrior state. I mean, that's really not, to my mind, what the army was all about or is meant to be. I mean, I have relatives who've been in the army, and I have a brother-in-law still serving in a very senior position. I have a lot of respect for and strong support to the army. I've seen the Indian army at close quarters as a UN peacekeeping official, and which are my respect for the Indian army as second to none in the world who was born. So I can tell you that there's a lot to be said for the army, but not the way the BJP does, including, of course, not just fetishizing the army, but trying to make them above and beyond criticism, putting them on their election posters after every military action, advertising in a chest-thumping way every quote-unquote surgical strike. That wasn't the way the army was meant to be used by Indian democracy.
Shashi, 3 more points, and I'm running short on time. You partly answered this before I interrupted you, but I think it's important to revisit. Have Hindu nationalists arrogated Gandhi's legacy for themselves?
Yes, I mean, I partially answered this because what Mahatma Gandhi stood for, and which the Hindutva movement despised as an epitome of weakness, of non-violence, and so on, and indeed of too much fondness for minorities, Muslims in particular, that idea actually is something which they're putting aside by adopting Mahatma Gandhi's glasses for the Swachh Bharat campaign, paying ritual obeisance to him on his 150th birthday. All of these things that the government tries to do or adhering to the substance of his message and his philosophy.
Okay. Has social media made bigotry respectable?
Social media has made bigotry respectable, partially because it has made it permissible to say things in a public space that in the past people would have thought twice about even saying privately. That's probably true worldwide, but in India it's become starkly apparent because I grew up in India where some of the things I'm hearing now on social media and on political platforms are things that no respectable middle-class home would ever have permitted to be uttered in their living rooms, behind closed doors. But now it's all possible to say. And what is more, people draw aid and comfort from knowing that their secret prejudices are actually acceptable because others are expressing them openly on social media. So they too join the bandwagon. It's pretty grim stuff.
Final question, Shashi Tharoor. What should a new India be?
Well, I think it ought to be an India in which every Indian has the same rights, the right to love, to live, to eat what they want, to dress as they like, to worship as they choose or not, to be able to speak the language they like, associate with the people they like, pursue the beliefs they like, as long as they're not harming other Indians. It seems to me that what is essential in the new India is what Amartya Sen talked about. It's a fulfillment of capabilities. We need to maintain, enshrine, and deepen and strengthen the civic institutions of our nationalism in order to ensure that our people are able to develop themselves and to be who they wish to be. That's the kind of new India that democracy should make possible, rather than an India where we're being press-ganged into a uniformity, one nation, one language, one religion, one state, one leader. That kind of India is not the India that I believe I can cherish, and I believe the alternative India is one that I must, and many like me must continue to fight for.
In fact, that's a great way of ending this. Thank you very much, Shashi Tharoor, the battle of belonging. I'm just going to read one final quote linked to what I just asked you. What should a new India be? In your words, it'll be a new India where you won't get lynched for the food you eat, marginalized for the faith you hold dear, criminalized for the person you love, or imprisoned for making use of fundamental rights guaranteed by your own constitution. Isn't that the India we all seek? Shashi Tharoor, pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Vishnu. Jai.